Well, welcome to God's country right here on the Cinnabar. Now, I'm a huge history buff, and the other day I was filming an episode on this part of the ranch, and as I looked around it occurred to me just how much history has taken place right here around us where we're sitting today. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're not going to focus quite so much on vintage firearms, although we might do a little shooting just to kind of hold your attention. But we're going to do what we call a Cinnabar history tour. So today we're going to talk about things like some of the earliest known habitation of man in the Western Hemisphere that's right nearby here. We're going to talk about some would-be bank robbers, at least one of them that was caught right here on this property. We'll visit a Native American vision quest and look at an old picture of one of the last of the Paiute Indians that came and gathered wild plums that grow right here on this part of the ranch. We'll talk about the John Fremont and Kit Carson expedition that came right through across this property right here where we are. And as an added bonus at the end, I'm going to show you a large stone map of this entire basin that's at least centuries old. So if you enjoy history at all, stick around because this is shaping up to be really a fascinating episode. I know I'm really looking forward to it. Now let's switch gears a little bit and go back more than 14,000 years. If you look over my left shoulder, way out across the lake bed over there, there's kind of a dark ridge line over there. We call that 5 Mile Point. And at the base of it's 5 Mile Caves. Archaeologists believe they have found the oldest or earliest evidence of human habitation in the Western Hemisphere right there. Goes back more than 14,000 years. Previously they thought that man had only existed here for about 11,000 years, which coincided with the extinction of the saber-toothed cats and the huge short-nosed or cave bears that lived here. Didn't believe that man could coexist with those mega predators. Well, the old professor that led that dig, he told me that they actually found some bear bones over there in that excavation that had tool marks on it from man. So the ancient people that lived here weren't just tough enough to coexist with those mega predators, they actually ate them. Gives you a whole new respect for those folks. Not only could survive out in this country with no modern conveniences, but dealing with stuff like that as well. So there's some incredible history around here. Now stick with us a little bit. We're going to go find another vantage point where we can see a few more things, and then we're going to take a few shots, talk some more about this old Winchester 1894. So let's start off our history tour with a story that's going to sound like it come right out of the Old West, with bank robbers and townsfolk chasing them down out across the desert out here. But this story actually took place in 1957, when a couple of dumb criminals come through our area and mistook our post office for a bank, decided to stop and rob it. Sadly, one of the locals tried to break it up and was gunned down right out in the street. And as you might imagine, it didn't sit real well with the local folks. So they took off and chased through some hunting rigs in their vehicles and took off after these guys. And if you notice, there's a real sharp corner right up here on the highway that's caused a lot of wrecks. And those criminals, of course, they were going way too fast and they lost it around that corner. The local folks caught up with them then, and one of them was trying to take off that away, and well, they shot him right in the backside and gathered him up. But the other, he made it clear up over the top of the rim, and he was gone for a couple of days till he run into a couple of hunters. One of them happened to be an off-duty sheriff, so they gathered him up and cuffed him. So that kind of ended that little sad chapter in our history here. I guess the moral is if you're gonna be a criminal, probably this would be a good place to stay away from, because there's some good old boys around here who've got some pretty good skills that can break that kind of thing up. So let's move on to the next spot, and before we do, maybe we ought to take a couple of shots so we don't lose your attention a little bit. Uh-oh. Now this may look like just a couple of rocks stacked up on top of a boulder, and it is, but we think it's really more important than that. See, we believe this is what we would call a vision quest, or more accurately, what was used to commemorate a vision quest. A vision quest is kind of a religious rite of passage that was used by most tribes in North America. And here I'm told that the natives that were here commemorated that vision quest by stacking 1 or 2 rocks on top of a big boulder where they were fortunate enough to receive that vision. And typically they occur like in an area like this where there's a real panoramic view or a scenic vista that they would overlook. And they would spend several days fasting and meditating, inviting a vision from their creator or their ancestors or spirit guides to kind of give them a direction that their life should take, or maybe see what they should be doing with their lives. So they would sit in an area like this until they received that vision, and if they were fortunate enough to receive it, then they would stack up 1 or 2 rocks here just to commemorate that. So while it may just be a couple of rocks and I'm all just washed up, I think it's really more than that, and really kind of an interesting spot. And continuing on our Cinnabar history tour, I've seen an old picture in a newspaper clipping that I believe was taken right here. And it shows a northern Paiute by the name of Gadue, and I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, with pitted and drying wild plums laid out here. And in the background on this old road, and this is the old road before the highway was built in the 30s, there's an old car up there. So we know it was probably in the early 20th century sometime. And the clipping talks about that the Paiutes will come back to this spot on an annual, they called it a pilgrimage, on buckboard wagons to gather the wild plums when they were in season. So this must have been a really important spot for them, because this was decades after they'd been removed to the reservations. And the Paiute reservations are a long ways from here. It would take several days to get here, to gather their wild plums, and to go back. So this must have been a very important spot for the Paiutes. Now we know that they were nomadic and they traveled around, so we assume that in the fall of the year when the plums were ripe, that this was a place that was important to them to stop and gather up those wild plums and dry them, and was probably a staple during the winter months. So it's kind of fascinating to see that picture and then to be able to kind of place exactly where it happened. And there's still wild plums here. There's actually wild raspberries, and there's a lot of game here too. So I'm assuming that this was pretty important to them to come back to it for decades and decades after they had been removed to the reservation, and to make such a long trip. Now as we continue with our history tour, if you look over my left shoulder, there's a very prominent point coming off of the rim called Fremont Point. In 1843, an exploration party led by John Fremont and his guide Kit Carson came over this rim right in that area, trudging through snow in the springtime, and looked down upon this lush basin below them. They named a lot of these landmarks around here at that time. They skirted around up to the north and then came right down through this area right along the edge of the lake. Now, Kit Carson's probably a name that you recognize. He was a very famous western frontiersman. And John Fremont has a lot of things named for him out here in the West because of his exploration. He even went on to win his party's nomination for president, trying to turn his notoriety from his explorations into a bid for the White House. And he almost made it. You know, I guess looking back 150 years after his death, he may still be more qualified than some of the choices we've had lately, but that's a story for another time. Now Kit Carson and John Fremont may have been the first whites to map this area, but they were by no means the first people to map this area. So stick around. We're gonna trudge on down the hill and take a look at something really special, and I'll stick around for this because I think you're really going to enjoy it. Now, my wife and I had to think long and hard before we decided to film this and put it in this episode. But ultimately we decided that it's too important not to document and share. We just desperately don't want to curiosity seekers and definitely not anybody who would vandalize this. But what you're looking at here is a map of this entire basin carved out on this rock. And it's pretty hard to see through the camera. You can probably pick up some of the lines that are etched in it. There's some concentric circles in places here and there. It's really just a fascinating piece of history here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera off here shortly, and then I'm going to chalk in all these lines to make them easier to see, and then we can kind of talk about, and I'll give you my unprofessional opinion on what it all means. So stick around. I think you'll really enjoy this. Okay, so this is just fascinating. I've done my best to chalk in the lines as I can make them out here and kind of color code them. Unfortunately, the chalk makes it look far more amateurish than it is in real life. We think these red circles are places where there were encampments or villages, and probably the bigger and the more circles, the more important the camps were. And we know that this coincides with a lot of the places where there have been a lot of artifacts found. Up here there are a lot of petroglyphs up in this area. Here there are some hot springs that were a lot of artifacts found in that area. Over here there's some more hot springs where there were artifacts found. There was a major encampment down in this area with a lot of artifacts. If this were a centuries old "You Are Here" map, this is probably where we are right here. And it makes sense that they would portray this site. There were a lot of artifacts found here. Unfortunately, unscrupulous people in past decades have just looted everything that they could pack away from this site. There's really nothing left except for this rock here, and unfortunately it was heavy enough they couldn't pack it off. Now this blue line I've got out in the middle here, I think is probably a high water shoreline for the lake that's in the bottom of the basin here. The double white lines here we think were the rim. Remember I talked about where Fremont and Kit Carson came over the rim. That's a major landmark, and if you knew how this basin laid in here, you'd understand just how accurate this map is and how it portrays this basin very, very well. The other white lines we think were trails that they used between the encampments, and if you'll notice, every encampment has a trail coming and going from it, and some of the more major encampments. So that makes perfect sense. Now the Paiutes, who were the last indigenous peoples here, were kind of nomadic. They didn't just move randomly, but they moved throughout the season, depending on what they were hunting or what things were coming ripe. We talked a little bit about the wild plums earlier. So it makes sense that they had a lot of trails going around this area. Now some of these, in this particular area, because of the geography of it, some of these over on the east side of the basin are out in the desert. And then when you get over onto the west side over here, this is a very high elevation over the top of the rim up in the timber and whatnot. So in this area they had a real diverse environment to live in, from the desert with a huge lake in the middle to high country, timbered, different hunting opportunities. There's antelope out in that area, there's bighorn sheep and a lot of mule deer out here. So they just had a area where they could move around, follow the game, or again, whatever plants they were using to eat. And so this is just really a wonderful piece of history for this basin, and it's fantastic that it's still here and hasn't been defaced in any way, and we'd certainly like to keep it that way. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our little history tour today. I've just had a blast. I'm just a big history buff, so going around and looking at these sites is really enjoyable for me. If you liked what you saw today, give us a like, subscribe to our channel. We'll be back again with vintage firearms in the next episode. But we sure appreciate all your support. Until we get together next time, happy trails from the Cinnabar.